Welcome, viewers, to a tale that will chill you to the bone and make you question every delicious bite you've ever savored. We've all heard the whispers of secret ingredients and hidden recipes, but tonight, we unravel a story so horrifying, it will forever change the way you look at your favorite comfort food. Before we delve into the heart of this culinary nightmare, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the shocking truths we're about to uncover. Now, settle in, because we're about to serve you the bloody truth behind the beloved goat delicacy. The village of Oakhaven was a serene tapestry of rural life, nestled in a valley cradled by the imposing Blackwood Mountains. Its cobblestone streets, lined with quaint cottages adorned with vibrant flower boxes, usually echoed with the cheerful chatter of a close-knit community. Life in Oakhaven was simple, dictated by the turning of the seasons and the age-old traditions that had bound its people together for centuries. Central to these traditions was the annual festival of 5 villages, a grand celebration of the harvest where Oakhaven and its 4 neighboring villages would come together for a day of feasting, music, and friendly competition. The centerpiece of this festival, the dish that drew people from miles around, was the legendary crimson goat stew, a goat delicacy so exquisitely flavored it was said to be a gift from the mountain spirits themselves. This year, the honor of preparing the crimson goat stew had fallen to young Alara, a woman whose culinary skills were whispered to be magical. Her grandmother, the matriarch of Oakhaven's most respected family of cooks, had passed down the secret recipe, a legacy that was both a great honor and a heavy burden. The recipe was more than just a list of ingredients and instructions. It was a sacred trust, a collection of cryptic verses and intricate rituals that had to be followed with unwavering precision. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold on the day of the festival, Alara was already in the bustling village square. The air was thick with the tantalizing aromas of baking bread, simmering spices, and roasting meats. Villagers, their faces bright with anticipation, were setting up long wooden tables and decorating the square with colorful banners and wildflowers. The festive atmosphere, however, did little to soothe the knot of anxiety in Alara's stomach. She had spent the night poring over the ancient, leather-bound recipe book, its pages brittle with age and filled with her grandmother's elegant, looping script. There was one verse, in particular, that had always troubled her, one that spoke of the crimson toll and the silent bleat of the goat. Her grandmother had always been evasive when asked about it, her usual warmth replaced by a shadow of sorrow. "The mountain gives, and the mountain takes," she would say, her voice barely a whisper. "Some flavors are born of sacrifice." Alara tried to push the unsettling words from her mind as she directed the other cooks, her voice clear and confident despite her inner turmoil. The goats, specially selected for the crimson goat stew, had been brought down from the high pastures of the Blackwood Mountains. They were a unique breed, their coats the color of freshly fallen snow, and their eyes a startling sapphire blue. The villagers believed these moon goats were sacred, their meat imbued with the mystical properties of the mountain. As the day wore on, the square filled with people from the 5 villages. Laughter and the lively music of fiddles and flutes filled the air. Children with their faces painted like forest sprites chased each other through the crowd, their shrieks of delight mingling with the symphony of celebration. The aroma of the crimson goat stew, now simmering in a massive cauldron over a crackling fire, grew more potent, a rich, savory scent that made mouths water and stomachs rumble. Among the merry crowd was Liam, a young man from the neighboring village of Stonebridge. He was a stonemason by trade, with a quiet strength and a keen eye for detail. He had been secretly in love with Alara for years, captivated by her fiery spirit and her passion for her craft. He watched her now, a graceful figure amidst the chaos of the kitchen, her brow furrowed in concentration as she added a pinch of a rare, crimson-colored herb to the cauldron. As the sun began to dip behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, the village elder, a man with a face like a weathered map and eyes that held the wisdom of generations, stepped onto a makeshift stage in the center of the square. His voice, though frail with age, carried an authority that commanded the crowd's silence. "Friends, neighbors, children of the 5 villages," he boomed, his arms spread wide in a gesture of welcome. "It is time to honor the bounty of the land and the spirit of our community. Let the feast begin." A thunderous cheer erupted from the crowd as Alara and her team of cooks began to ladle the crimson goat stew into wooden bowls. The stew was a vibrant, deep red, its rich, velvety texture studded with tender chunks of goat meat, wild mushrooms, and root vegetables. The first bite was an explosion of flavor, a complex symphony of savory, sweet, and earthy notes that danced on the palate. The meat was so tender it seemed to melt in the mouth, leaving behind a lingering warmth that spread through the body. As the villagers partook of the delicacy, a sense of euphoria seemed to wash over them. Their laughter grew louder, their conversations more animated. Even the most stoic faces were softened by a beatific smile. It was as if the crimson goat stew had a magical ability to wash away all worries and inhibitions. Liam, however, found himself unable to completely surrender to the merriment. As he ate, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He had noticed a subtle shift in the demeanor of the Oakhaven villagers in the days leading up to the festival. There was a furtive quality to their glances, a hushed urgency to their whispers. And then there was the matter of the crimson toll. He had overheard snippets of conversation, whispered words exchanged in the shadows of alleyways, that spoke of a secret pact and a debt that had to be paid. His eyes were drawn to Alara, who was now standing by the cauldron, her face pale and her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and something that looked like fear. He saw her discreetly pass a small, intricately carved wooden box to the village elder. The elder nodded gravely and disappeared into the crowd. Later that evening, as the festivities began to wind down and the villagers, their bellies full and their spirits high, began to make their way home, Liam saw something that made his blood run cold. He had wandered to the edge of the village, seeking a quiet moment to gather his thoughts, when he saw a procession of Oakhaven men, led by the village elder, making their way towards the Blackwood Mountains. They carried torches, their faces grim and determined, and in their midst, they were leading a single snow-white moon goat, its sapphire-blue eyes gleaming with terror in the flickering torchlight. A chilling realization dawned on Liam. The crimson toll was not a metaphor. It was a literal payment, a sacrifice offered to the mountain in exchange for the ingredients that made the crimson goat stew so irresistible. The secret ingredient, the thing that gave the stew its unique flavor and its euphoric effect, was not an herb or a spice. It was something far more sinister. Driven by a desperate need to know the truth and a growing fear for Alara's safety, Liam decided to follow the procession. He knew that he was venturing into a world of ancient secrets and dark rituals, a world from which he might not return. But the thought of Alara, her face etched with a silent sorrow, spurred him on. He had to uncover the bloody truth behind the beloved goat delicacy, even if it meant risking his own life. The taste of the crimson goat stew, once a source of delight, now felt like a bitter poison in his throat. The festival was over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. As Liam trailed the procession from a safe distance, the festive sounds of Oakhaven faded behind him, replaced by the eerie silence of the Blackwood Mountains. The path they took was a treacherous one, a narrow, winding trail that snaked its way up the steep, rocky slopes. The air grew colder, and a thick, cloying fog began to roll in, obscuring the path ahead. The torchlight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like malevolent spirits. The men from Oakhaven moved with a grim determination, their faces set in stone masks. They spoke in low, hushed tones, their words snatched away by the wind. Liam strained to overhear their conversation, but all he could make out were fragmented phrases. The pact must be honored. The spirits demand their due. For the prosperity of the villages. The procession finally came to a halt in a small, circular clearing deep within the woods. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching up to the sky like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree was a crude stone altar, stained with the dried blood of years past. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the men bind the terrified moon goat to the altar. The village elder stepped forward, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight. He began to chant in a strange, guttural language, his voice rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. The other men joined in, their voices a low, monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. As the chant reached its crescendo, the elder produced a long, ceremonial dagger, its blade glinting menacingly in the torchlight. He raised the dagger high above his head, its point aimed at the heart of the helpless goat. Liam's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to rush forward and stop this barbaric ritual, but his feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and a morbid curiosity. He had to know. He had to understand the terrible secret that bound the 5 villages together. At that moment, a figure emerged from the shadows of the forest. It was Alara. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a desperate plea. "Stop!" she cried, her voice trembling but clear. "There has to be another way." The elder turned to her, his eyes cold and hard. "You know as well as I do, child, that there is no other way. The pact was made long ago. The prosperity of our villages depends on this sacrifice." "But it's wrong," Alara insisted, her voice growing stronger. "We can't keep feeding this darkness. We have to break the cycle." A murmur of dissent rippled through the group of men. Some of them looked uneasy, their eyes darting nervously between the elder and Alara. Others, however, seemed to share the elder's conviction, their faces hardening with grim resolve. "The girl is right," a voice called out from the back of the group. It was a young man not much older than Liam. "My father took part in this ritual for years. It haunted him until the day he died. He told me that the mountain spirits are not benevolent creatures. They are cruel and demanding. They give us prosperity with one hand and take our humanity with the other." The elder's face contorted with rage. "Silence, boy! You know nothing of the sacrifices our ancestors made to ensure our survival." He turned back to the altar, the dagger raised once more. But before he could strike, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the clearing. It came from the direction of the village. The men looked at each other in alarm, their ritual momentarily forgotten. Then came another scream, and another. The sounds of panic and terror were now clearly audible, carried on the night wind. "Something's wrong," one of the men said, his voice laced with fear. "We have to go back." The elder hesitated for a moment, his face a mask of conflict. His loyalty to the ancient pact was warring with his duty to protect his village. Alara seized the opportunity. She rushed to the altar and, with a single swift motion, cut the ropes that bound the moon goat. The terrified animal, now free, bolted into the darkness of the forest. The elder let out a roar of fury. "You foolish girl! Do you have any idea what you've done? You've broken the pact. The spirits will not be pleased." But his words were drowned out by the growing din from the village. The screams were now accompanied by the horrifying roar of something not quite human, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Liam knew that he had to get back to the village. He had to find out what was happening. He also knew that he couldn't leave Alara behind. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "We have to go," he said, grabbing her hand. "Now!" Together, they ran back towards Oakhaven, the sounds of chaos growing louder with every step. The other men, their faces pale with terror, followed close behind. The bloody truth behind the beloved goat Delicacy was far more horrifying than Liam could ever have imagined. The crimson goat stew was not just a dish made from a special goat. It was a dish tainted by an ancient and terrible evil, an evil that had now been unleashed upon the unsuspecting villages. The festival was over, but the hunt had just begun. As they burst out of the tree line and into the outskirts of Oakhaven, the sight that greeted them was one of pure, unadulterated horror. The once charming village was now a scene of chaos and devastation. Cottages were ablaze, their thatched roofs licked by roaring flames that clawed at the night sky. The cobblestone streets were slick with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and death. And then they saw them, the creatures responsible for the carnage. They were tall, gaunt, humanoid figures, their bodies a grotesque fusion of man and goat. They had the torsos and arms of men, but their legs were the hind legs of a goat, complete with cloven hooves. Their heads were the most terrifying of all, a nightmarish blend of human and bestial features. They had the horns of a goat, long and curved, and their eyes glowed with a malevolent crimson light. Their mouths were filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth, and a low, guttural growl emanated from their throats. These were the mountain spirits, the ones to whom the villagers of Oakhaven had been making sacrifices for generations. But they were not the benevolent beings of folklore. They were demons, and they had come to claim their due. The villagers were fighting back, but it was a losing battle. The men, armed with little more than farming tools and hunting knives, were no match for the supernatural strength and ferocity of the goatmen. The creatures were tearing through the village, their claws and teeth ripping through flesh and bone with sickening ease. Liam watched in horror as one of the creatures cornered a young woman and her child. The woman shielded her child with her own body, her terrified screams drowned out by the creature's guttural roar. Without thinking, Liam grabbed a heavy iron skillet from a nearby overturned cart and charged at the creature. He brought the skillet down on the creature's head with all his might. The blow would have felled a normal man, but the creature merely staggered back, a look of surprise on its monstrous face. It then turned its glowing red eyes on Liam, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Before the creature could pounce, an arrow hissed through the air and embedded itself in the creature's shoulder. The creature roared in pain and surprise, giving Liam the precious seconds he needed to grab the woman and her child and pull them to safety. He turned to see Alara, a bow in her hand and a quiver of arrows on her back. Her face was a mask of grim determination, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire. "We have to get the villagers to the old church," she shouted over the din of the battle. "It's the only place that's safe." The old church, a formidable stone structure that had stood for centuries, was perched on a small hill overlooking the village. Its thick stone walls and heavy oak doors offered the best hope of protection against the rampaging goatmen. Liam and Alara, along with the other able-bodied villagers, began to shepherd the terrified survivors towards the church. It was a chaotic and desperate retreat. The goatmen were everywhere, their horrifying roars echoing through the night. The villagers fought with the courage of desperation, their makeshift weapons clashing against the creature's razor-sharp claws. When they reached the church, the village elder, his face a mixture of guilt and horror, was there to meet them. He was clutching the ancient, leather-bound recipe book in his trembling hands. "I was wrong," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I was so blinded by tradition that I couldn't see the truth. The pact was a lie. It wasn't about prosperity. It was about appeasement. We weren't honoring the spirits. We were feeding them." He opened the book to a page filled with a different kind of script, a series of dark, angular runes. "This is the true nature of the pact," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's a curse. The crimson goat stew didn't just give us a feeling of euphoria. It marked us. It made us more palatable to them." A wave of revulsion washed over Liam as he remembered the rich, savory taste of the crimson goat stew. The secret ingredient wasn't just the meat of the moon goat. It was the fear and desperation of the sacrifice, a dark energy that had been infused into the very fabric of the dish. As the last of the villagers scrambled into the safety of the church, the goatmen began to surround the building. They clawed at the stone walls and pounded on the heavy oak doors, their roars of rage and hunger echoing through the hallowed halls. The villagers huddled together in the darkness, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. The sounds of the creatures outside were a constant, terrifying reminder of the horrors that awaited them. Alara, her face streaked with soot and blood, was tending to the wounded. Liam watched her, his heart filled with a mixture of admiration and a growing sense of dread. They had survived the initial onslaught, but they were trapped. It was only a matter of time before the goatmen broke through. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, a new sound was heard, a sound even more terrifying than the roars of the goatmen. It was the sound of a horn, a deep, resonant blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. The goatmen outside fell silent. And then, a new figure appeared at the edge of the village. It was massive, far larger than the other goatmen. It had the body of a giant, muscular man, but its head was that of a goat, with huge, curling horns and eyes that burned with a hellish light. It was carrying a massive, double-bladed axe, and its roar of rage was so powerful that it sent a tremor through the ground. This was the leader of the goatmen, the one they called the Mountain King. He had come to claim his feast. The bloody truth behind the beloved goat delicacy had been revealed, and the 5 villages were about to pay the ultimate price for their culinary tradition. The night of terror was over, but the day of reckoning had just begun. The first rays of sunrise pierced through the stained glass windows of the old church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors upon the horrified faces of the villagers huddled within. The silence outside was more unnerving than the chaos of the night before. It was a heavy, pregnant silence, full of the promise of impending doom. The Mountain King had arrived, and his presence had brought a chilling stillness to the pandemonium. Inside the church, the initial shock had given way to a grim, gnawing fear. The wounded moaned softly, their whispered prayers a stark reminder of the brutality they had witnessed. Children clung to their parents, their wide, tear-filled eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. The people of Oakhaven, and the few survivors from the other 4 villages who had come for the festival, were a community on the brink of despair. Alara moved among them, a beacon of calm in a sea of terror. Her culinary skills were now replaced by the hands of a healer, as she cleaned wounds with scraps of cloth and spoke words of comfort to the afflicted. Her hands, usually dusted with flour and scented with spices, were now stained with blood, but her resolve was unbroken. The guilt she felt over her role in perpetuating the dark tradition was a weight on her shoulders, but it was a weight she was determined to bear. She would not let her people perish for a secret she had unknowingly helped to keep. Liam, his makeshift weapon, the iron skillet now discarded for a sturdy wooden plank he had found, stood guard at the main entrance. He watched Alara as she worked, his heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. He had always admired her strength and passion, but now, in the face of this unimaginable horror, he saw a new depth to her character, a fierce, unyielding courage that inspired him. He knew he would do whatever it took to protect her, to protect all of them. The village elder, his face a mask of profound regret, sat hunched over the ancient recipe book, his gnarled fingers tracing the dark, angular runes that described the pack's true nature. He had spent his life upholding the traditions of his ancestors, blind to the terrible truth hidden beneath the surface. Now, with the blood of his people on his hands, he was desperately searching for a way to atone for his folly, a way to break the curse that had plagued their villages for centuries. The pact was forged in a time of famine, he said, his voice hoarse, as if the words themselves were a painful confession. Our ancestors were starving. They were desperate. The Mountain King offered them a deal, a bountiful harvest and a unique delicacy that would bring fame and fortune to our villages. In return, all he asked for was a small toll, a single moon goat, sacrificed once a year. He paused, his eyes welling with tears. But it was a trap. The toll wasn't just the goat. It was the fear, the desperation, the silent scream of the sacrifice. That was the secret ingredient, the thing that gave the crimson goat stew its addictive quality. It was a poison, a slow-acting toxin that made us more susceptible to their influence, more desirable. A wave of revulsion washed over the villagers as they listened to the elder's words. Their beloved delicacy, the centerpiece of their most joyous celebration, was a symbol of their damnation. They had been feasting on their own fear, their own desperation, for generations. As the elder spoke, a new sound from outside shattered the fragile peace within the church. It was a slow, deliberate, rhythmic pounding. The Mountain King had begun his assault on the heavy oak doors. Each blow was like a clap of thunder, shaking the very foundations of the ancient stone building. The villagers flinched with each impact, their faces pale with terror. Liam, along with a group of other able-bodied men, rushed to barricade the doors. They piled wooden pews and heavy stone baptismal fonts against them, creating a makeshift barrier. But they all knew it was only a matter of time before the Mountain King's relentless assault would breach their defenses. Meanwhile, Alara, her mind racing, was searching for another way out. The church had been built on the site of an ancient monastery, and she remembered her grandmother telling her stories of secret passages and hidden tunnels that had been used by the monks to escape persecution. If she could find one of those passages, they might have a chance. She began to search the church, her eyes scanning the stone walls and cold flagstone floor for any sign of a hidden entrance. She ran her hands along the walls, feeling for any loose stones or hidden mechanisms. Other villagers, seeing her desperate search, joined in, their fear temporarily replaced by a glimmer of hope. It was a young boy, no more than 10 years old, who found it. He had been huddled in a small alcove behind the main altar when he noticed a draft of cold air coming from the floor. He called out to Alara, his voice a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They cleared away the heavy, ornate tapestry that covered the floor and found a large stone slab with an iron ring set into it. It was a trapdoor. With a concerted effort, they managed to lift the heavy slab, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the earth. A musty, earthy smell wafted up from the darkness, a smell of damp soil and forgotten secrets. It was a daunting prospect, venturing into the unknown depths beneath the church, but it was a better alternative than facing the horrors that awaited them outside. Just as they were about to begin their descent, a deafening crack echoed through the church. The main door had splintered, and a massive, horned head with eyes that burned like embers peered through the opening. The Mountain King had broken through. Panic erupted among the villagers. They screamed and scrambled for the trapdoor, their desperation making them clumsy and slow. Liam, seeing the chaos, took charge. "Form a line," he shouted, his voice ringing out with an authority that surprised even himself. "Women and children first. We have to be quick, but we have to be orderly." His commanding presence had a calming effect on the panicked crowd. They began to move towards the trapdoor in a more organized fashion, their fear still palpable but now tempered by a sliver of hope. Alara, after helping the first group of women and children down the stairs, turned to Liam, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "You have to come with us," she said, her voice trembling. Liam shook his head. "Someone has to stay behind and buy you time," he said, his gaze fixed on the splintered doors. "I'll hold them off for as long as I can." He knew it was a suicide mission. He was not a warrior. He was a stonemason. But he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he didn't do everything in his power to save the woman he loved. Before Alara could protest, he pressed a small, intricately carved wooden bird into her hand. "I made this for you," he said, his voice soft. "I was going to give it to you at the festival." Tears streamed down Alara's face as she looked at the tiny bird, a symbol of a life they might never have. "I'll come back for you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I promise." Liam managed a sad smile. "Go," he said, his voice firm, "and don't look back." As Alara disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, Liam turned to face the splintered doors. He was joined by a small group of other men, their faces a mixture of fear and grim determination. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, not soldiers, but they were united by a common purpose: to protect their families, their community, their home. The Mountain King let out a deafening roar of frustration as he realized his prey was escaping. He threw his massive body against the weakened doors, and with one final, splintering crash, they gave way. The monstrous creature stormed into the church, its eyes blazing with fury. It was followed by a horde of its goatmen minions, their guttural growls echoing through the sacred halls. Liam and his small band of defenders stood their ground, their makeshift weapons held high. They knew they were about to die, but they were determined to die fighting. The battle that followed was a brutal and bloody affair. The villagers fought with desperate courage, their cries of defiance mingling with the monstrous roars of the goatmen. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but they sold their lives dearly. Liam, armed with a heavy iron candelabra, fought with a ferocity he never knew he possessed. He swung the candelabra with all his might, its weighted base crushing the skulls of the goatmen. But for every one he brought down, two more took its place. He saw the village elder, the ancient recipe book clutched in one hand and a splintered piece of a wooden pew in the other, fighting with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. He went down under a wave of goatmen, his final act a defiant roar of atonement. One by one, Liam's companions fell, until he was the only one left standing. He was surrounded by a sea of monstrous faces, their crimson eyes filled with a bloodthirsty glee. The Mountain King approached him, a cruel, triumphant sneer on its bestial face. It raised its massive, double-bladed axe, its polished surface reflecting Liam's own blood-streaked face. As the axe began its descent, Liam closed his eyes, his final thoughts of Alara, of her fiery spirit, her gentle smile, the feel of her hand in his. He had bought her time. He had kept his promise. But the killing blow never came. A new sound, a high-pitched, piercing shriek, filled the church, causing the goatmen to fall back in pain and confusion. And then, a figure, clad in shimmering silver armor, dropped from the rafters of the church, landing with a silent grace between Liam and the Mountain King. The figure was tall and slender, with long silver hair that seemed to glow in the dim light. In one hand, they held a long, elegant sword, its blade humming with a faint, ethereal energy. In the other, they held a silver horn, the source of the piercing shriek. The Mountain King let out a roar of enraged recognition. "You!" it bellowed, its voice filled with a venomous hatred. The silver-haired warrior said nothing, their face hidden behind a polished steel helm. They simply raised their sword, its point aimed at the Mountain King's heart. Liam, stunned and bewildered, could only watch as this mysterious stranger prepared to face the monstrous leader of the goatmen. The siege of the sanctuary was over, but a new, even more epic battle was about to begin. The fate of Oakhaven, and perhaps the entire valley, now rested on the shoulders of this enigmatic, silver-clad warrior. The air in the church was electric with tension, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. The Mountain King, its initial rage now tempered with a grudging respect, circled the silver-armored warrior, its massive axe held at the ready. The goatmen, their bestial bloodlust momentarily forgotten, watched from the shadows, their glowing red eyes fixed on the two combatants. Liam, still reeling from his near-death experience, staggered to his feet, his mind struggling to process the sudden turn of events. Who was this mysterious warrior? And where had they come from? The warrior, their posture relaxed yet ready, seemed to exude an aura of calm, a stark contrast to the miasma of fear and rage that filled the church. They moved with a fluid grace, their silver armor catching the faint light from the stained glass windows. The Mountain King was the first to strike. It charged forward with a deafening roar, its axe a blur of motion as it brought it down in a powerful, overhead arc. The warrior, with a speed that seemed almost supernatural, sidestepped the blow, the axe crashing into the stone floor with a shower of sparks. The warrior retaliated with a series of quick, precise thrusts, their sword a silver serpent that darted in and out, searching for a chink in the Mountain King's thick, leathery hide. The Mountain King, despite its size, was surprisingly agile, and it parried the blows with the flat of its axe, the sound of steel on steel echoing through the church. The battle that followed was a deadly dance, a clash of brute force and elegant precision. The Mountain King fought with a raw, unrestrained fury, each swing of its axe capable of shattering bone and crushing stone. The warrior, on the other hand, fought with a calculated grace, their movements economical and efficient, their sword a silver blur. Liam watched, mesmerized by the spectacle. He had never seen anyone move with such speed and skill. The warriors seemed to be everywhere at once, their sword a silver shield that deflected the Mountain King's relentless assault. Meanwhile, in the darkness of the tunnels beneath the church, Alara was leading the survivors to what she hoped was safety. The air was cold and damp, and the only light came from a single, sputtering torch she carried. The tunnels were narrow and claustrophobic, and the sound of their own footsteps, amplified by the confined space, was a constant reminder of their precarious situation. The passage was a labyrinth of winding tunnels, and Alara had to rely on her memory of her grandmother's stories to guide them. She led them through a series of dark, echoing chambers, their walls covered with ancient, faded frescoes depicting scenes from the monastery's long and tumultuous history. As they ventured deeper into the earth, they began to hear a faint, rhythmic sound, a sound that grew louder with every step. It was the sound of a hammer on an anvil, a steady, reassuring sound that spoke of life and industry in this dark, subterranean world. They followed the sound until they came to a massive, underground cavern, its ceiling studded with glowing crystals that cast a soft, ethereal light on the scene below. In the center of the cavern was a forge, its roaring fire casting a warm, orange glow on the faces of a small community of people who were gathered there. They were a strange and wondrous sight. They were tall and slender, with pointed ears and an otherworldly grace. They wore simple, homespun clothes, but their faces were etched with a quiet wisdom that seemed to speak of a long and ancient lineage. These were the Silver Elves, a reclusive and almost mythical people who were said to live in the deepest, most hidden corners of the Blackwood Mountains. The elves, who had been alerted to their presence by the sounds of their approach, greeted them not with suspicion but with a quiet, compassionate understanding. Their leader, a woman with long, silver hair and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 years, stepped forward. "You are safe now, children of the valley," she said, her voice a soft, melodious whisper. "The Mountain King's reign of terror is about to end." It was then that Alara noticed the exquisitely crafted suits of silver armor and the long, elegant swords that were being forged in the heart of the cavern. It was the same armor as that worn by the mysterious warrior who was currently battling the Mountain King in the church above. The elven leader, whose name was Lyra, explained that her people had been watching over the 5 villages for centuries, their hearts heavy with sorrow as they witnessed the dark pact that had been made with the Mountain King. They had been waiting for the right moment to intervene, a moment when the people of the valley were ready to break free from the shackles of their own fear and tradition. "The warrior you saw," Lyra explained, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sadness, "is my daughter, Arion. She is the last of the Silver Guard, an ancient order of elven warriors who have dedicated their lives to protecting the innocent from the forces of darkness." Back in the church, the battle between Arion and the Mountain King was reaching its climax. Both combatants were beginning to show signs of fatigue. Arion's movements were still graceful, but there was a slight tremor in her hands. The Mountain King's roars of rage were now interspersed with ragged gasps for air. He knew he was losing. The silver-haired warrior was too fast, too skilled. He had to end this now. With one last, desperate roar, he charged at Arion, his axe held high. But this time, Arion didn't sidestep. She stood her ground, her sword held in a two-handed grip. As the axe began its descent, she lunged forward, her body a blur of motion. She ducked under the Mountain King's swinging axe and plunged her sword deep into his chest. The Mountain King let out a final, gurgling roar, its eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. It looked down at the silver blade protruding from its chest, and then at the silver-haired warrior who had defeated it. It sank to its knees, a river of thick, black blood pouring from the wound. And then, with a final, shuddering gasp, it collapsed onto the stone floor, its massive body still and lifeless. A stunned silence fell over the church. The goatmen, their leader now dead, let out a collective wail of despair, and then, as one, they turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the forest from which they had come. Liam, his heart pounding in his chest, approached the silver-haired warrior, his mind still trying to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Arion, her body trembling with exhaustion, removed her helm, revealing a face of breathtaking beauty, a face streaked with soot and blood, but also a face filled with a quiet, profound sadness. "It is finished," she said, her voice a soft, weary whisper. At that moment, there was a sound of footsteps, and Alara, followed by the other villagers and a contingent of elven warriors, emerged from the secret passage. Alara's eyes met Liam's, and with a cry of relief, she ran into his arms. The reunion of the villagers was a mixture of joy and sorrow. They had survived, but they had lost so much. Their homes were destroyed, their friends and family gone. But they were alive and they were free. In the days that followed, the people of Oakhaven, with the help of the Silver Elves, began to rebuild their homes and their lives. The bodies of the fallen were laid to rest, and a new sense of community, forged in the fires of adversity, began to emerge. The ancient recipe book, the symbol of their dark past, was thrown into the forge and consumed by the flames. The crimson goat stew, the beloved delicacy that had been the source of both their prosperity and their damnation, would never be made again. Liam and Alara, their love for each other now solidified by the trials they had endured, stood side by side, hand in hand, as they looked out over the valley. The Blackwood Mountains, once a symbol of fear and superstition, now seemed to hold a new promise, a promise of a brighter, more hopeful future. The bloody truth behind the beloved goat delicacy had been a bitter pill to swallow, but it had also been a catalyst for change. The 5 villages, now united by a shared trauma and a renewed sense of purpose, were ready to forge a new legacy, one based not on fear and sacrifice, but on courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The festival was over, but the future was a blank page, waiting to be written. And for the first time in a very long time, the people of the valley felt a sense of hope. They had faced their demons, both literal and figurative, and they had emerged from the darkness, stronger and more united than ever before. The Crimson Reckoning had been a painful one, but it had also been a necessary one, a cleansing fire that had cleared the way for a new beginning.